Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Life in the Wildlands podcast, where we discuss exciting opportunities with outdoor careers, share professional experiences, and provide advice to overcome the hurdles to federal employment. I'm your host, Becky Schufelt, and today we have Kelly Martin, who is a retired wildland firefighter, and she's going to share how she started her career and provide advice for those that want to enter into a wildland firefighting career. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kelly. Go ahead and tell us more about yourself.
Hi, Becky. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really glad to be with you today, and it's quite an honor. I'm excited for the conversations and excited for the questions ahead.
So tell us a little bit about your career and how you got started in wildland firefighting.
Sure. So I was born and raised in the Midwest in Northern Illinois. And even at a very young age, I was very, very interested in the outdoors. And as a matter of fact, a lot of people, when you talk to wildland firefighters, they finally remember, how did fire play a role as a young child or as you were growing up? And my dad actually allowed us to burn the leaf piles after we raked them. So it's kind of his little way of saying, hey, I need you to do project work around the house. And then when you're done, hey, guess what? You get to light the leaves on fire. So that was like pivotal for me that I remember. And so from there, I went to school in northern Wisconsin and Michigan and ended up as a co-op student while I was still in college, working as a park ranger for the National Park Service. And then from there went to Grand Canyon. And that's really where I got my start in wildland fire. It was really pretty amazing experience in my early 20s about working in the outdoors. And that was something that I really, really knew that I always wanted to do, was to work in the outdoors. And so you never really kind of know what you're going to do when you grow up, but I just knew that I really wanted to be outside rather than inside.
So you mentioned the co-op program with the National Park Service. Was that it?
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain a little bit more on what that program is or was?
Yeah, so it does change over time. And I think now you're starting to see, early career or what they called STEP or SCEP type of appointments. And it really does look at who is out there in terms of women and minorities, not all the time, but really trying to recruit and retain women and minorities in unique career fields that may be predominantly occupied by men. And so this was an opportunity at that time to get into a field that, from a park ranger, wildland fire perspective, certainly that was dominated by men. So what that did was give me an opportunity to work as what they called a career conditional seasonal when I got the job. And then also when I finished with my bachelor's degree, I had 120 days to be converted to a career conditional type of appointment. And the first place that offered me a job was Grand Canyon National Park. So from the very beginning, I made it known that I was very interested in a career, either, as a backcountry ranger or a wildland firefighter.
And so that program, would the equivalent today be like the Pathways program, where it gives opportunities, not always that transition into a permanent position, but some of them do. So is that kind of similar?
It is, because it really promotes the ability for a person to continue with their schooling. And so for me, it was outdoor education with an emphasis in biology. And so that was a good, dare I say, pathway to a career in the outdoor field. So yeah, I think those programs still exist, but I haven't really paid a whole lot of attention to, what kind of hiring appointments are still out there.
So just for our listeners out there, there is the Pathways program, similar to the program that Kelly mentioned back when she was first starting her career. But as things evolve, now it is the Pathways, and that does allow students to get some great, valid experience in the field while going to school, and can lead to permanent positions. So Kelly, after what exactly was your job with the National Park Service when you were in that program?
So I started as a GS3 in 1984. And so for 3 summers that I worked for the Apostle Islands, I worked as a park aide. I think I worked my way up to, say, a GS4 within those 3 years, during the summertime. And basically it was a generalist. I got trained in wildland fire, boat patrol, and as in interpretation as well, or a naturalist for the Park Service. So again, I was 20, 21 years old. So I think that's a really, really good way to start, because a lot of us don't really know what we want to do or be, or what kind of job we really want to roll into in our early 20s. Some do, and that's great. But I didn't really have that epiphany until years later that it was going to be wildland fire. So I was trying different jobs in the outdoors. And so when I finished my 4-year degree, and I had 3 seasons of experience at the Apostle Islands with the National Park Service, so I had an opportunity to really, what they did was basically put the word out that, hey, we have this graduate, they have a bachelor's degree, they fit the bill for interpretation, backcountry patrol. I didn't have, a law enforcement background. And so the experience combined with the education, I think, was a winning combination for me, because I also had a degree in criminal justice. So at one point I was considering law enforcement. So having that as a base to kind of start from, I ended up with like 4 different offers initially when I got out of school. And since I grew up in the Midwest and really hadn't spent any time in the Western United States, I was super thrilled to get my first offer at Grand Canyon National Park. So I took off in a 72 Dodge pickup and with all my worldly belongings and left the Midwest. And to this day, I vividly remember seeing Grand Canyon for the first time. It's just one of those spectacular things you never forget. And that was 1986, I believe it was, the fall of 86. So.
Wow, that sounds like quite the adventure. And, I do think it's a great program. And back in your day, it was called something else, and now it's the Pathways program. But I want to tell our listeners that it is an awesome opportunity to take a part of, because you may not know exactly what you want to do, but at least you'll get a taste of it to see whether it is something you want to pursue or something maybe that you don't want to pursue. So it's a
Absolutely.
really good entry level position. And so from there, you journeyed into fire. Is that correct?
Yeah, I did. The other caveat that I'd like to make with the kind of the Pathways program is I wouldn't want people to feel scared that they have to jump into this and have a permanent full-time job in their early 20s. I would highly, highly recommend, staying as fluid and adaptable as possible, especially if you're interested in working in the outdoors and you don't want to be indoors. You want to spend as much time as you can in natural resources and physically very tough and demanding environments. By all means, don't think that you have to or should accept a permanent full-time year-round job. And I think for me, that was little, because I did a lot of, expeditions and hiking and rafting and mountain biking in my 20s, and I wouldn't trade that. We were all pretty poor then, couch surfing and eating top ramen, but the times that you have
Yeah.
in your 20s are just they're just unforgettable, and I wouldn't trade it
Ah,
for the world. And I'm so glad that even at that time I had already started working for the Park Service, in my early 20s, and then mid 20s made it to Grand Canyon. And believe it or not, so my first job there was in interpretation or as a naturalist at a place called Desert View. And of course, when you're in your early 20s, you don't want to be stuck behind a desk. And that's kind of what was happening to me, is that, oh, I'm really good with talking to the public and interpreting, the cultural and natural history of Grand Canyon. But I was like, I was just getting more and more depressed, feeling like I'm here in one of the most spectacular places in the world, and I'm in this museum, and I'm like, I have to figure out a way to get out, and have my boots on the ground, literally. And that's really when I had a couple of really great mentors, neighbors, coworkers that really encouraged me to think about wildland fire and or backcountry patrol. I did start with structure fire at Grand Canyon, and then realized that I was also an EMT, and I had a really tough time dealing with like 3 plane crashes. I responded to 3 different plane crashes in like 6 months. So that's really when I kind of shifted to the outdoors into wildland fire. It was still outdoors and still an emergency response. And yeah, it was mid 80s. And I remember taking a helicopter flight over on the North Rim. And it was one of my first fires. And we were dropped off, and the supervisor said, "Hey, we'll see you in a week." And I was like, "Really? I get to stay out in this one of the most gorgeous places in the world?" And at that time, it was called prescribed natural fire. So we stayed out for a week, and upon returning, we got picked up again by the helicopter, and we were returning to the South Rim. It was late in the afternoon, early evening, but the sun was setting in the western part of the park. So here we are, all dirty after a week of really hard work, flying back to the South Rim and watching the sunset in the eastern part of the western part of the canyon. It was like, I knew at that point, this is the job that I wanted to do. So that really that was the springboard, the epiphany that said, yeah, I'm going to do wildland fire for a career.
And isn't it great, though, that there's such a variety of different positions within natural resource management and conservation with these land management agencies like the Park Service, the Forest Service, so that you could try something out, but there's such a realm and broad spectrum of different jobs you can do that might fit your needs a little bit better than others. And so in your case, it wasn't necessarily being an interpreter, being stuck at a museum, like you said, but it was actually getting out and working in fire. And so I think it's great because something may not work for you specifically, but you can once you get your foot in the door with one job, you can kind of get experience and fill out other positions that might be better for you. So that's a great story.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that obviously was one of the pivotal moments that got you hooked into Wildland Fire. Is there any other stories that you have or any other experiences that you have that it just kept reaffirming that this is what it is? I'm going to continue doing this for an entire career.
That's a really good question. I remember thinking the feeling about working for public land management agencies, there was something very, very special about the fact that you would never see a no trespassing sign. And so the concept of, being and working on public lands and doing natural resource management, to me, I think that was my overriding love and passion in my heart. It just so happened I got to practice fire as part of that. But I think a career as a public servant for public land management agencies is quite a noble calling. And I felt that at a very, very early age. And I still do. And I think the fact that fire is such an incredible element on the landscape, it really kept me interested in continuing with this lifetime career because, as we all know, fire can be incredibly destructive and destroy life and property and really have significant effects on watersheds. But it can also be very, very beneficial when applied during the right time and right place, especially with 100 years of fire suppression and tremendous growth and development throughout the West. So that it's a tricky combination now, but I think that's where, if I was to look back and what kept me going, it really was being able to work in the outdoors. I personally worked for both the Park Service, National Park Service, and the U.S. Forest Service, but there's also Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and Bureau of Indian Affairs are the 5 agencies that work in wildland fire. And those are the biggest agencies also that have careers in natural resource management, outdoor careers.
Yeah, and you made a good point that there are others, and a lot of the time we talk about Forest Service and the Park Service, but there are several other agencies that also hire wildland firefighters in the federal government. But one question I really wanted to talk to you in case we have females out there in our audience that might want to pursue a wildland fire career. I know that some women might be a little intimidated kind of going into a male-dominated career. So can you tell us a little bit? And I know you've got a lot more time in with the agency than I do. I just have 21 years in with my own experience working as a female in a male-dominated career. But have you seen any positive changes throughout your career before you retired when it comes to women in this line of work?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot more women that are really affirming they belong. They're here. We deserve an opportunity to do and be our very best, regardless of whether or not we're male or female. I do believe that this current generation of 20 and 30-year-olds are a lot more tolerant of diverse people and opinions and views and backgrounds than, say, my generation and generations before me. There's definitely, when I was growing up, definitely issues with gender bias, discrimination, sexual harassment. And as a young person, I didn't feel like I had anywhere to turn. And that was really unfortunate that culture then gets instilled because a lot of people do know that if there's bad behavior in the workforce, that it's very difficult for women to report because we often get labeled the troublemaker. Sometimes it's a he said, she said issue. And then we just almost have to plug our nose, close our eyes, and whistle past the graveyard in order to, persevere through a career that we really, really love and want to stay in. And I've had that conversation with so many women that they don't really feel like some of these acts or behaviors are a federal case, but it gets so tiring and exhausting to feel like it's just the really low grade harassment or bullying or disrespect or humiliation or oppression. I mean, all of this adds up. And so I think for a young woman coming into a field, there's a lot of wisdom in at least being able to know that you are going to be isolated in areas that you're going to be the only woman. And you have to actually find the strength, the grit, and the perseverance to kind of know that this type of behavior is unacceptable in this day and age. And to know that you might be exposed to that, what's the antidote to helping prevent a hostile environment where you get bullied out or pushed out because you just can't take it anymore? So I think that as a leader, as a supervisor, has a tremendous responsibility to know and understand what are acceptable words, actions, and deeds, and what are unacceptable. And I think that's a really good place to start from developing strong crew cohesion and respect for each other on the crew. And I tell people all the time, let's just start with the premise that we're all going to treat each other with the utmost in human dignity first and foremost. And I think that's really where you begin to see the development of a high performance team. You're excited about going to work. Your team is excited. They support each other. And how great is that when you can work in a high performance team, knowing that you can talk about the difficult conversations and know what's acceptable and what's not, and then perform it at your highest and your best. It's really a tremendous feeling when you can get to that point.
Yeah, I would agree. And I've been on some really high performing teams on a male dominated field, working with the Forest Service. And in no means, I don't want to sugarcoat any of this for our audience because I think it is important as a female. If you're looking to get into this field, you need to know what you might be looking at moving
Mhm.
forward. So, what do you see are the resolutions to this as a woman coming into fire today, or what are the challenges that they might still expect?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it really has to be something that you have a passion and a drive for. You can't go into, and this is probably true of most natural resource management type of positions, because the work is physical, it is long, it is hard, arduous, it is dirty, it is smoky. And so you physically have to be prepared for that. It's quite obvious if you're not physically prepared, if you're unfit, if your boots don't fit, if you're not able to keep together as a team physically is very important. And so I would say, physical ability, and then also recognize that competence, continuing to increase your skills, and don't ever be afraid to ask for a coach and a mentor. And I think trying to, fake your way through it is also problematic. And I've seen that before too, but oftentimes that comes from a place of fear that you're not going to be accepted or respected. But keep pushing.
Yeah.
And then self-confidence. I think, that's people can really tell especially in a group situation if you lack self-confidence. And so continuing to develop, competency, confidence in your chosen field is good advice for any career field you might be entering that's a male-dominated career field.
Yeah, that's some great advice. And for our audience, Kelly, I mean, how many years did you have in with the Forest Service or just wildland firefighting?
So total, I had 35.
So you come from a wealth of experience, and I wanted to highlight you. And the reason I wanted you to become a guest on our show is the amazing things that you have done within your career recently, being involved with the Grassroots Wildland Fire Organization, which is a nonprofit. How can you tell our audience a little bit more about that and how it's paving the way for the future of firefighting?
Sure. Several years ago, I think it was 2019, there's always a group of people that attend the National Cohesive Strategy, and it is an opportunity for everybody from all walks of life that are involved in wildland fire to kind of showcase some of the emerging issues or policies at a national level. And I've always been very interested in policy at a national level, but when I was working for the government, I just felt almost helpless to really affect policy changes. And so this was yet another moment in my life and my career that we were listening to policy statements and opportunities that would be coming forth in the next year or two. And there were several of us that were still field-going firefighters that were like, not one word, not one deference to wildland firefighters. And at some point, we just kind of finally had to say enough is enough. We have to highlight the issues and the need for reforms and really put that front and center to our agencies and elected officials, because no one else is doing that. And we know that we're having tremendous attrition to other agencies, state agencies, municipals, and people just dropping out altogether. So the public really loses when a well-trained workforce can no longer see career advancement or opportunities or compensation or benefits. They have to leave after about 15 years. There is no clear opportunity for them to continue on in their career. So armed with that, there's myself and two other people just decided that our time was right. We start conference calls every other week, and then we just gathered like-minded individuals, and our point was to, be a group of education, outreach, and advocacy for much-needed reforms for wildland firefighters, because our voice was not being heard with our elected officials, with our agencies. And so we really had to say, you know what, we're going to start calling our elected officials, and we're going to start telling our stories. Because the stories are hundreds of stories out there about the oppressive conditions that current firefighters are now working in, that this system might have been good 50 years ago, but it is so incredibly broken right now that somebody had to pick this up. And so that's how Grassroots was formed, is to really look at, how we can influence reforms and work with our agencies and elected officials and national media outlets to really tell the stories. And then that also forms the basis for reforms, legislative reforms and bills in the House and the Senate.
Wow. And What you're doing is just instrumental and it's progressive, and I love everything about it because you're right. What the policy was 50 years ago is not necessarily up to fitting what the current conditions are in our current climate.
For sure.
Um, and if there's any opportunity for me to help in any way, I'd be happy to do so. I think it's an important fight, and what you're doing and what the grassroots wildland fire organization is doing is really helping to make conditions better in the long run for anybody entering into the career field these days. So I commend you and your group for that. Yep.
Yeah, we are an all volunteer organization, so it's really driven by heart and passion that these reforms are so necessary if we're really to address,
Absolutely.
classification, compensation, benefits, mental health and wellness, workforce that's dedicated to public land management. There's just so many facets to the way we're approaching the issues and reforms, and it has to do with our 4 pillars. And yeah, just type in grassroots wildland firefighters and you'll be taken to our website. There's tons and tons of information on there and in ways for people to get involved as well.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. We're going to switch gears a little bit here. So kind of going back to your career and then knowing everything that you've put into it, your involvement now with grassroots, Wildland Fire, and then you were in kind of a similar pathways type program to start your career. You built and built and got promoted. Is there anything that you wished you would have known sooner that would have made a difference in your career?
I love looking back and doing the shoulda, coulda, woulda sometimes, and you just never know. But I think what some of the things that I'm involved in now is like Women in Fire Training Exchange. I love supporting young women and telling my stories and having them tell their stories and to create a network of women that we may not be in the same geographic area. We have very few women that are maybe on our crew. And so it does feel so extremely isolating and lonely. And so now we've created this training where it's a 2-week opportunity to do prescribed burning together. And it really forms a really incredible network that we can't get otherwise. And if you really think about it, the men who work in fire, their network is already built in. They're mostly men on the crew, men within the district or the force, men, they're all on fires together. And so when we go to fires, it's like, oh, we look out in the sea of people and there's a few women, we may or may not know them. So we've made a deliberate attempt to kind of create this networking, a lifetime opportunity of networking in a community of practice that women can now call on each other, and they know that we've all have very shared experiences. And I think that's comforting to know that we're not out there, by ourselves. And I think that what I'm seeing now, that would have made a difference in my career early on because I just felt so isolated and so alone. So having those unique opportunities for women to work together was really tremendous. And then the last thing I would say is I found myself falling into a trap of trying very, very hard to do everything right because I was so fearful of failing because it feels like if I do fail that it affirms to the broader culture that women aren't cut out for this. So I felt like I beat myself up so much. And maybe what I should have done is just find some really close men mentors, which I did have. I had, tremendous men mentors, but I guess I beat myself up a lot knowing that I couldn't make mistakes. And so I guess that's a
Yeah.
thing I would throw out there for everybody too. And it's men and women is that we should be allowed to fail, not to the point where somebody
Hmm.
gets hurt or killed, but to the point where it's like build your resiliency and know that you have to have each other's back when we're in an emergency situation. And I think that's really, really important. So that I do think that is a difference that I'm starting to see is that people are
Hmm.
more resilient because of mistakes and they're not being humiliated. And that was my intense fear the whole time I was growing up, is the humiliation of making a
Yeah.
mistake. So
Yeah, it's tough because as women, at least I felt I was always trying to keep up with the men and
yeah.
I didn't want to make a mistake. But I think it all comes down to leadership. And so for those women out there that want to pursue an outdoor career with wildland fire in the federal government, I want to go back a little bit to what you were saying about the community of women and what you're doing with your grassroots wildland fire organization is building a stronger community of women wildland firefighters. So how would one get into, is there a pathway into that? Is there some connections that women can contact to kind of get more assimilated in this so that they're not alone?
There's a really good program that was started probably over a decade ago by the Nature Conservancy called TREX trainings, TREX. And that was really what started the W TREX. So I think that, and I do work for the Nature Conservancy as a prescribed burn boss in W TREX events, because we feel that it's really important for women to see women in leadership roles. So we can also provide opportunities for, oh yeah, if you can see one, you can be one. And I think that's always been a really strong force in my life as well. Now, with grassroots in particular, we're very holistic, so we haven't really centered around gender issues specifically, but the work that we are doing,
Okay.
that I do believe that because myself and Riva are on grassroots, that people are seeing women in leadership roles. So it's making a strong statement about women in fire without really calling it out as women in fire. But
Hmm.
I really recommend it. The Nature Conservancy has some great fire programs. It's very similar to the federal agencies of working a fuels module or a wildland fire module. So don't think that you always have to start with the federal agencies. There's other programs, again, like the Nature Conservancy, and you can just type on the internet, the Nature Conservancy wildland fire management jobs. So there's lots of resources out there, and it's really a matter of creating that network locally. And I would also recommend that if this is something that you really want to do, reach out to educators, your instructors. I've done a lot of work with, say, Stevens Point and Virginia Tech and University of Idaho, Moscow. So there's lots of different fire programs that are in both 4-year and 2-year colleges that people can search out and begin their both training and experience and networking opportunities, starting with some of the junior and 4-year schools.
Yeah, and it sounds like some of these programs, like I said, with the Nature Conservancy, if it's an all-female training group or all-female crew that is doing, this type of work, that would actually build some strong confidence in women before being kind of inserted into a male-dominated field. Would you agree?
Yeah, the thing that I tend to see now that's a little different than what I remember when I started in the 80s and 90s. There's a lot more women, and it's almost as if you have to pay your dues on a hotshot crew. Hotshot crews are very, very demanding, and oftentimes the hurdles are so significant from a physical standpoint of view that it's almost next to impossible. Not always. There's some really rock star women on hotshot crews. Don't get me wrong; they run circles around me, and I love seeing them on fires. But it always kind of seems that that's the high bar, when in reality, there's lots of other opportunities out there in fire, on fuels crews, IA crews, initial attack crews, or engines or heli-tac, that aren't out there on the front line day after day. So, but gaining that competence and confidence on the fire line is definitely very, very important part of the growth and development in wildland fire.
Great. So we're running out of time, but is there any last important information you want to share with folks that might be interested in pursuing a wildland fire career?
I think you're starting to see some efforts more and more in the media about specific recruitment programs for women. I think those are great, that they're always needed. But where things fall short is when you do decide to make this a career, there'll be obstacles. Some of them are quite hidden in terms of the support that you need to continue on with a career like this, because it is so difficult. So both as women and men in middle management and upper management need to know that there's women that are really trying to come up through the ranks. And if you don't purposely get to know them, shake their hand, ask them how it's going, ask them about their career aspirations, they often feel like they get left behind when their male colleagues or counterparts get the better training assignments, or they're offered more opportunities for training than women are. It's very difficult for us to say, hey, what about me? So we're here. So I just ask that people pay particular attention, that just because you've recruited women, there's also really significant retention issues in this that I wish people would know and understand, because that's really what gets very frustrating, is that when, I was working on an incident management team and I was removed from my team the very last year before I retired because they wanted to place someone else in that position. And you have no idea like how much work goes into trying to develop your own personal reputation, your relationships with other people on the team, which I had done for almost 7 or 8 years. And then to be removed from that team and placed on another team was absolutely devastating. It's easy for men to assimilate from probably one team to another, but to do it to a woman really undermines the whole idea that women are supported in this organization. And we need to really be more conscious of that. There's things that we do unconsciously with implicit bias that really negatively affect women. So I think there's opportunities there to have more open discussion and dialogues about implicit bias and gender bias in this within probably most natural resource management fields. But once you start having those conversations, then you can begin to say, wow, I didn't know I was doing that. Or I didn't even know that until you said something. So we have to really figure out how to create opportunities to be more open and be less afraid of the difficult conversations of things we may not see. We're only one person. We have 2 eyes and 2 ears and 1 mouth. And each one of us has opinions and perspectives from our own point of view. They're not right, they're not wrong, but oftentimes we don't have the ability to communicate that there's certain things that are occurring that feels very oppressive and very isolating that really needs to be addressed.
Wow, I couldn't have said that any better. Thank you so much, Kelly. It's been a pleasure to have you, and I feel so honored to have you here as a guest. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but for our audience, stay tuned next time for our next episode. Bye now.
Thanks very much, Becky.
For more stories about outdoor careers, subscribe to the Life in the Wildlands podcast, where I will be interviewing outdoor professionals to discover exciting opportunities in outdoor careers, share professional experiences, discuss the hurdles to federal employment, and provide advice on how to overcome these challenges. And if you're interested in outdoor jobs and don't know where to start, or if you already are a federal employee with an outdoor career that's struggling to make it to the next level in your career development, Life in the Wildlands can help you on your journey. Check out our career counseling and federal resume development services at www.lifeinthewildlands.com or call 406-848-1660.